Every day for almost 40 years, the Heath family was tormented by questions about what happened to Wayne D. Heath, a loving father and war hero who disappeared without a trace during a fishing trip in 1986 in the serene waters of the Snake River in Idaho. Years later, when hope seemed all but lost, a single forgotten piece of evidence held the key to unraveling this decades-old mystery. What followed was a breakthrough that would stun investigators and finally bring the answers that had eluded Wayne's family for so long. Born and raised in Idaho Falls, Wayne graduated from Highland High School in Pocatello in 1967. Shortly after, he enlisted in the Army in 1968, serving his country with distinction as a helicopter mechanic during the Vietnam War. His bravery did not go unnoticed. He received awards for his service, including a commendation from the White House for saving lives under fire. After his military service, Wayne settled back in Pocatello, where he married Wanda Mendenhall and started a family. He was a loving husband and father to his children, deeply involved in their lives. Wayne was a man whose love for the outdoors was matched only by his devotion to his family. He was extremely passionate about his hobbies, which included fishing. Little did anyone know that a simple fishing trip would set off a series of events that would become a waking nightmare for the Heath family. April 1, 1986 started like any other day for Wayne D. Heath. He and a friend decided to take advantage of the pleasant spring weather and go fishing on the South Fork of the Snake River, just below the Palisades Dam in Bonneville County. It was a favorite spot for many locals, known for its scenic beauty and plentiful fish. Out on the river, fishing just below the Palisades Dam, the two faced an unexpected and tragic accident. The boat's anchor rope became entangled in the propeller, causing the vessel to quickly take on water. The situation turned dire in a matter of moments. Both men abandoned the boat in a desperate attempt to swim to shore. Tragically, Wayne never made it to the shore. Witnesses reported seeing him disappear approximately a quarter of a mile downstream from the dam. Despite extensive search efforts involving divers and search docks, his body was never found. The disappearance of Wayne left his family and the community in a state of shock and sorrow. The Bonneville County Sheriff's Office launched a thorough investigation, conducting multiple searches of the river and surrounding areas, weeks into months and eventually months into years. Wayne was presumed to have drowned, but with no body or definitive explanation to what really happened. The case grew cold, but the memory of Wayne's disappearance never faded. For his daughter, Nicole Heath, the pain was especially acute. She was only 11 years old at the time, and the loss of her father left an indelible mark. Nicole dedicated herself to preserving his memory, compiling photos, articles, and family history in a black binder she carried with her everywhere. She visited the Snake River every year, hoping for closure, but finding only more questions. Then, in June 2009, a seemingly small but significant breakthrough occurred. A local resident, while fishing in the Snake River near Heiss in Jefferson County, discovered a human tibia bone on a sandbar. The bone was turned over to law enforcement, reigniting hope in the long-dormant case. It was sent to the University of Texas Health Sciences Department, where researchers worked diligently to extract DNA. By January 2013, they had rendered a DNA profile for the tibia and entered its genetic data into the Unidentified Human Remains Index of CODIS. But the journey to identify the remains was far from over. The bone remained unidentified for another 11 years, highlighting the often slow and meticulous nature of forensic science. In February 2024, the Bonneville County Sheriff's Office received a crucial notification from the University of Texas. The genetic data associated with the tibia bone had been linked to family DNA reference samples from Wayne Heath's natural son and sister. Advancements in DNA technology and the accumulation of genetic data over the years had finally reaped the rewards investigators had been hoping for years. Nearly 4 decades after his disappearance, Wayne D. Heath's remains were identified. This discovery allowed detectives to close the case and provide long-awaited answers to the Heath family. For Nicole, it meant a semblance of closure. The mystery that had haunted her since childhood was finally resolved, and she could find peace knowing her father's fate. The sheriff's office said, "The Bonneville County Sheriff's Office is grateful for the assistance of the University of Texas, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, Idaho State University Department of Anthology, and the Ada County Coroner's Office in resolving this case." The sheriff's office continued, "We recognize the importance of providing closure and answers to families who have missing loved ones. This case is a great example of partners and resources who work hard to apply advancements in DNA and technology to these cases decades later. Our hope in this instance is relief for the Heath family and peace of mind." In the stillness of a February night in 1977, a mother's worst nightmare unfolded. What began as a routine evening for 14-year-old Maria Hansel, babysitting her neighbor's children, ended in a brutal and violent crime. Nearly 5 decades later, a breakthrough in DNA technology finally unraveled the mystery, bringing justice to Maria and closure to those who loved her. Maria Lorraine Hansel was a vibrant 14-year-old girl living in Colorado Springs. Known for her kindness and responsibility, Maria often babysat for neighbors in the apartment complex on North Nevada Avenue. On the night of February 7, 1977, Maria was looking after her neighbor's 2 children, a task she had performed numerous times without incident. The neighbor checked in with Maria earlier in the night, and everything was seemingly normal. But when she returned home around 11:20 p.m., she walked into a scene of horror. Maria was found in the master bedroom, lifeless on the floor, with multiple stab wounds to her chest and neck. The children, aged 6 and 8, were found asleep in their beds, unharmed, and unaware of the tragic events that had transpired. The gruesome discovery prompted an immediate call to the Colorado Springs Police Department. Officers arrived swiftly, initially responding to what was reported as Maria possibly taking her own life. That changed when officers arrived at the scene, which clearly indicated a violent case of foul play. The initial investigation revealed little in the way of solid leads. The young son of the neighbor provided a chilling account to the police, recounting how he had been awakened during the night. He walked out into the hallway and witnessed a male figure holding Maria's mouth and taking her into the master bedroom. The suspect, described as a white male around 17 years old, 6 feet tall, with acne, and wearing a fluffy blue coat, blue jeans, and black sneakers, vanished without leaving a clear trail. Despite the harrowing eyewitness account and the immediate efforts of law enforcement, the investigation soon hit an end. Evidence collected from the scene, including a blood stain on Maria's jumpsuit, was carefully preserved. But without the advanced forensic technology available today, it led to no significant breakthroughs at the time. Years turned into decades, and Maria's tragic case grew cold. The community held on to hope, but as time passed, the prospect of justice seemed increasingly elusive. Maria's family continued to mourn, their pain compounded by the lack of answers. In 2019, more than 4 decades after the violent crime that would take Maria's life, a ray of hope emerged. Advancements in DNA technology had revolutionized the field of forensic science, allowing investigators to re-examine old evidence with new methods. The blood stain on Maria's jumpsuit, long preserved in evidence storage, was submitted for analysis to Parabon Nanolabs. Using cutting-edge techniques, they developed a detailed suspect profile from the DNA sample. The profile was then compared against entries in public genealogy databases. This method, which had recently gained prominence for solving other cold cases, finally provided a match. William Charles Kernan Jr. Kernan, a student at a local college at the time of the slaying, had been an acquaintance of the woman Maria was babysitting for. He had been to the apartment complex on multiple occasions, making his presence there on the night of the crime plausible. Kernan had passed away of natural causes in 2010, and his body had been cremated, leaving no direct DNA samples to confirm the match. Despite this, the genetic genealogy results, combined with the contextual evidence, gave investigators confidence that they had identified Maria's perpetrator. In 2024, the Colorado Springs Police Department made a public announcement. They declared the case of Maria Hansel's tragic demise solved, identifying William Charles Kernan, Jr. as the perpetrator. Although Kernan could not be brought to justice due to his demise, the resolution of the case brought a measure of closure to Maria's family and friends. The statement from CSPD read, "The family and friends of Maria Hansel have waited over 47 years to get justice for Maria. Through years of analysis and investigation, CSPD is proud to finally provide answers to Maria's loved ones." District Attorney Michael Allen emphasized the relentless pursuit of justice by law enforcement. "We do not stop searching for justice for victims. If there is someone out there that has committed a crime and has not been caught yet, we are looking for you. We are going to use every technology that develops over time to find you and bring you to justice." David Hansel, Maria's brother, said, "They have come through for us. I hope for other families it can be the same." He also said, "I have been on the phone probably once a week for the last 5 years, calling, and they have come through for us." Tracy Thompson, a cold case detective with CSPD, said, "It can be difficult because, you want to provide information. You want to give the family good news. And when you are talking to them and constantly telling them, 'I am sorry, I do not have anything right now,' breaks your heart." In a small town west of Niagara Falls, a mystery that had eluded detectives for a quarter of a century was finally unraveled. The brutal slaying of 26-year-old Nadine Jurchensky, discovered in a roadside ditch in 1999, had long been a haunting cold case. But with the advent of cutting-edge genetic genealogy, investigators were able to connect the dots and reveal the identity of the elusive perpetrator. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the haunting truth about who was responsible for Nadine's tragic fate came to light, bringing both revelation and closure to a grief-stricken family. Nadine Jurchensky was a 26-year-old woman from Toronto, Canada. Known for her vibrant personality and warm presence, Nadine was not just a daughter, wife, and mother. She was also a cherished member of her community. Nadine's life was marked by her strong connections to her family. Although she and her husband, Paul, got divorced, they remained in contact and raised their children. On May 8, 1999, Nadine Jurchensky's lifeless body was discovered in a roadside ditch near Victoria Avenue and 8th Avenue in Lincoln, Ontario, a small town west of Niagara Falls. Had been strangled to her end. Her body was found by passers-by who alerted the Niagara Regional Police Service, NRPS, to the grim discovery. The initial investigation into Nadine's tragic case was complex and challenging. Police quickly identified her from images of her face that were shared with the public, but finding the person responsible proved elusive. Detectives focused their efforts on piecing together a timeline and establishing Nadine's movements leading up to her demise. They suspected that the perpetrator was a truck driver, given the nature of the crime scene and Nadine's work at a strip club, which might have brought her into contact with transient individuals. Investigators canvassed truck stops between Niagara and Mississauga, where Nadine worked, and scrutinized potential suspects. They also collected and analyzed DNA from the crime scene, uploading it to national and international databases, including Interpol. Despite their efforts, no matches were found in the existing databases. In 2006, police investigated Michael Durant, a suspect linked to other violent crimes in the area, but he was eventually ruled out as a suspect in Nadine's case. Michael's connection to the case was dismissed, as there was no evidence linking him to Nadine's violent slaying. As the years went by, the case went cold, with no new leads or breakthroughs. It was not until 2021 that significant progress was made. The NRPS, in collaboration with the Toronto Police Service's Cold Case Unit, the Centre of Forensic Sciences, the Chief Coroner's Office, and Ontario's Ministry of the Attorney General, began using advanced genetic genealogy techniques. DNA from the crime scene was sent to a specialized laboratory in the U.S., which used genetic genealogy similar to consumer DNA testing services like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe. The lab created extensive family trees based on the DNA profile, narrowing down potential suspects. In 2023, the investigation zeroed in on Joseph Archie Raymond Brousseau, a truck driver who had worked in the Niagara region. Although Brousseau had passed away in 2017, Investigators obtained a DNA sample from his remains and compared it with the DNA from the crime scene. The match confirmed that Brousseau was responsible for Nadine's demise. Further investigation revealed that Brousseau had traveled extensively and had connections to the Niagara region, aligning with the initial suspicions about the nature of the crime. He was 34 at the time of the slaying. Detective Staff Sergeant Andrew Neville revealed, "Being a truck driver, we were able to determine that his trucking routes brought him in and through the Niagara region. He was a trucker throughout Canada and the United States, and we were able to determine that he utilized some of our roadways in Niagara, which could lead to his familiarity with the area." The resolution of Nadine Jurchensky's horrific case after 25 years brings a measure of closure to a long-suffering family and showcases the importance of the remarkable advances in forensic science on cold cases. While Brousseau's demise makes any legal accountability impossible, the breakthrough highlights the dedication of law enforcement and forensic experts who tirelessly worked to solve the case. Nadine's family expressed their gratitude to Niagara Police in a statement and fondness for new technologies that progressed the closure of the case. "We want to recognize that Nadine was an incredibly important part of our family. She meant more than a news headline. She was a beautiful young woman inside and out, mother, wife, and now grandmother, who had her whole life ripped away from her and everyone who loved her. She is very loved and missed every day by her whole family, and we will always make sure her memory lives on forever." In a quiet corner of Bothell, Washington, a haunting mystery lay dormant for nearly 3 decades. On a fateful April night in 1993, 15-year-old Melissa Lee vanished from the safety of her home, only for her body to be discovered the next day, discarded and left to be forgotten in a ravine. The case eventually grew cold. That was until the relentless advances of modern forensic science resurrected the case from obscurity. The clues hidden in genetic strands and discarded cigarette butts that would finally help unmask a predator. Melissa Lee, a vibrant and hopeful 15-year-old from Bothell, Washington, was a young life full of promise and potential. Melissa lived a content and simple life, and no one could have predicted the terrible fate that awaited her. On the evening of April 13, 1993, 15-year-old Melissa was alone in her home. Her family, her mother, Sharon Lee, and her mother's boyfriend, Gary McClellan, had gone out for a night of darts and karaoke. Melissa had planned to spend the evening with her friend, Krista Stromberg, but Krista's babysitting job extended later than expected, leaving Melissa by herself. At around 9:30 p.m., Melissa spoke briefly with her mother on the phone. This was the last known contact she had before her tragic end. The house was found in disarray when Sharon and Gary returned home. The front door was ajar and the lock broken. Inside, the living room was in a chaotic state. The coffee table was out of position, an ashtray was overturned, and a glass of milk had been spilled on the floor. The pet macaw was found outside its cage, indicating a struggle had taken place. Melissa was not at home. Sharon, realizing something was terribly wrong, reported her daughter missing to the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office around noon on April 14th. The family's concern quickly turned into a full-scale search. Later that evening, at approximately 6 p.m., a passerby walking across the Edgewater Creek Bridge in Everett noticed something unusual about 60 feet below in a ravine. Initially mistaking it for a mannequin, the passerby soon realized it was a body. The discovery was made on the north side of the bridge, in a remote and rugged area. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene and identified the body as Melissa Lee. Her clothing was found disheveled. She wore salmon-colored shorts and a San Jose Shark sweatshirt. An autopsy conducted by the Snohomish County Chief Medical Examiner revealed that Melissa had been manually strangled, often used as anesthetics or solvents. The crime scene, combined with the evidence from the autopsy, pointed to a brutal and calculated attack. Melissa's body was discovered in a location that was both secluded and significant, underscoring the premeditated nature of the crime. The early stages of the investigation focused on several leads. Alan Edward Dean, a 35-year-old resident of Everett, who had met Melissa through a talk line, quickly became a person of interest. Dean, who used the alias Michael, was interviewed 3 times in 1993. Despite his murky connection to Melissa and his questionable alibi, he consistently denied any involvement in her slaying. His statements and demeanor raised suspicions, but the lack of concrete evidence tying him to the crime meant investigators had to explore other avenues. Another potential suspect was Melissa's ex-boyfriend. He had an alibi provided by his parents, but conflicting information from his new girlfriend led detectives to scrutinize him further. Even with these discrepancies, his alibi held up under investigation and he was eventually cleared of any involvement. The technology available was insufficient to match the DNA evidence collected from Melissa's clothing and the crime scene with any known suspects. The absence of advanced DNA databases and the limited capability of forensic tools meant that the evidence, though crucial, could not directly link a suspect to the crime. The absence of direct witnesses and the disarray of the crime scene made it difficult for investigators to establish a clear timeline or motive. Without additional evidence or witness statements, the investigation struggled to gain momentum and the case grew cold. In 2018, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office decided to employ genetic genealogy. The DNA evidence collected from Melissa's clothing and crime scene, which had been preserved for years, was re-examined using modern technology. The state's crime lab and Parabon Nanolabs, a pioneering DNA technology company, played crucial roles in this process. A digital file containing Melissa's DNA genotype data was uploaded to a public genetic genealogy database. Through this database, genealogists were able to identify potential relatives of the suspect, creating a family tree that eventually led to the identification of Alan Edward Dean as the primary suspect. Dean, a 62-year-old resident of Bothell, Washington, was linked to the crime through his familial connections identified via genetic genealogy. Dean had been a person of interest since 1993 due to his previous interactions with Melissa, but the forensic limitations at the time had prevented his connection to the crime from being established. The breakthrough came when detectives obtained a discarded cigarette butt from Dean, which he had carelessly left behind. This cigarette butt provided a fresh DNA sample that was matched to the genetic profile from the crime scene. The confirmation of this match solidified Dean's status as the primary suspect in Melissa Lee's slaying. On July 28, 2020, Dean was arrested near his residence in Bothell. The arrest was carried out without incident and he was subsequently booked into the Snohomish County Jail on charges of first degree. For Melissa Lee's family, particularly her mother Sharon Lee, the long-awaited development was a bittersweet moment. During a press conference held the day after Dean's arrest, Sharon expressed her deep emotional relief, stating, "I am so happy I got to live long enough to see this happen. I hope he rots in hell." The trial, in March 2024, would ultimately determine the full extent of Dean's culpability and the appropriate legal consequences for his actions. On March 28, 2024, he was found guilty by the jury and on April 24, he was sentenced to 26 years in prison. At trial, Dean appeared emotionless and did not testify. But at the sentencing, he leaned forward in his wheelchair and exploded in rage. The victims, unsuspecting, were as follows. 21-year-old Althea Oakley was a student at the University of New Mexico. She was a go-getter with many bright prospects ahead. On June 22, 1988, Althea went to attend a party. It was at her boyfriend's fraternity. Everything was going great. She had a few drinks, but was not drunk or intoxicated. She got into an argument with her boyfriend. Words were exchanged. Not one to take needless attitude. She went out the door and decided to walk back home. Althea and her brother shared a house, so she walked south along Buena Vista Drive. That was the last time her friends saw her alive. According to reports, a woman heard screaming outside her house at 1320 Buena Vista Drive. It was the middle of the night, so she did not go outside, terrified of what might be out there. That woman, who chooses to remain anonymous, would testify years later. It was Althea screaming and fighting for her life. She was found fatally stabbed several times. An autopsy would reveal she had been severely intimately assaulted as well. 2 years later, her family established a scholarship in her memory to honor Althea. It was called the Oakley Scholarship. The first recipient of that scholarship would go on to become the chief of police in Albuquerque. That man tried everything in his power to get that case to progress, but it was all to no avail. This man is Chief Harold Medina. He knew Althea personally and vowed to do something to bring her parents and brothers some peace. 13-year-old Stella Gonzalez was a student who attended Washington Middle School in Albuquerque and was known for her bubbly personality and love of jokes. On September 9, 1988, Stella was walking back home after a party, accompanied by a friend somewhere near Tingley Beach. It is just that age where your parents trust you with a few decisions in life. Tragically, Stella's mother, Gina Cirillo, could never have known how much that would cost her. Gina was not in favor of sleepovers, but she allowed her daughter to stay the night at her aunt's house. She would be safe there. She did not know the girls would attend a party or walk home alone. She had no way of knowing this. Gina would later learn that the teenager had convinced her aunt to let her go out with a friend, and the two went to a party on the west side. Around 1:15 a.m., they were walking home when tragedy struck. Stella was not even alone. She was walking with her friend when an unknown suspect shot her in the head, cruelly. There was no reason for her to lose her life. The family had no enemies. She was a child. There were no signs of assault either. Even though she was rushed to the hospital, she lost her battle with the gunshot wounds almost 2 days later. Caitlin Arquette was born to author Lois Duncan on September 18, 1970. Lois penned the famous novel I Know What You Did Last Summer. On June 14, 1989, 18-year-old Caitlin graduated from Highland High School in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Caitlin had recently been accepted to the University of New Mexico with aspirations of attending medical school. Shortly after high school graduation, she moved in with her boyfriend Deng Nguyen, using money from an insurance settlement. Caitlin's mother was aware of the arrangement, although not fully informed about the boyfriend's age. He was actually 8 years older than Caitlin, but her family had been led to believe he was only 4 years older. The family liked him as he appeared to be a nice guy and was often around the house. Unfortunately, they did not know this, but Caitlin and Deng were involved in an insurance scam. They got the money, but he was afraid they would get caught. 6 weeks later, on July 16th, Caitlin confided in her mother about the serious problems she had been having with her boyfriend since they moved in together. She asked her mother to lie to him about her whereabouts, emphasizing the urgency of her situation. Caitlin explained that she had a big fight with Deng, was breaking up with him, and planned to go to a friend's house for dinner. She intended to either spend the night there or return to her parents' house, but she was not going back to the apartment. She wanted Deng to move out so this friend could move in as a roommate. She would feel safer. That night, Caitlin visited her friend, Sharon Smith, from 9:30 p.m. to 10:45 p.m., then headed east along Lomies Road towards her mother's house. On her way home, somewhere in the city's old town, a car pulled up alongside her, and someone inside shot her. She was shot twice in the head, which caused her car to drift between lanes and crash into a light pole. Officers arrived around 11 p.m. and made note of a gray Volkswagen Beetle at the scene. Off-duty Detective Ronald Merriman was the first officer at the scene, where he saw 2 cars parked on the sidewalk. He also saw a man named Paul Apodaca standing next to Caitlin's car. Merriman initially called in a report of an accident with no injuries before returning to the scene. Upon his return, he found Caitlin unconscious and covered in blood, thrown across the front seats of her car. Officer Marion Wallace arrived at the scene within a minute of being dispatched and observed only Caitlin's car, with Merriman and Paul Apodaca standing behind it. Merriman informed Wallace that Caitlin had been injured in a traffic accident and that he had called for an ambulance. However, Wallace noticed a bullet-shattered driver's side window and realized it was a crime scene, not a car accident. She then called for backup. Merriman and Wallace claimed that they opened the passenger door of Caitlin's car and found her bleeding heavily from her head. However, the medics from Albuquerque Ambulance, who transported Caitlin to the hospital, stated in affidavits that they responded to a routine call and found no police officers, police cars, or bystanders at the scene when they arrived. They reported that Caitlin was still alive, moaning and bleeding from her head, but no one was there providing her with first aid. A little before midnight, Lois Duncan received a distressing phone call from the hospital emergency room. The hospital informed her that Caitlin had been injured, but would not provide details over the phone. Lois and her husband, Don, rushed to the hospital, where they learned that Caitlin had been shot twice in the head and was in a coma. A famous author's daughter in the hospital is bound to get attention. Detective Steve Gallegos showed up at Caitlin's apartment to question her boyfriend, Dung. So as not to affect the boy's answers, he did not disclose Caitlin's shooting or accident. Dung showed them a note that read, "Han, I will be back home by 10. He claimed she had written the note, which the detective kept as evidence. The boy was informed about the accident and became distraught. After the police left, Dung went to the hospital to be by her bedside. Within a day, Caitlin succumbed to her injuries and passed away. Her tragedy made national news. Her mother was a famous writer, and years later she would even write a book about her ordeal. A fictitious novel, but a book on the circumstances surrounding Caitlin's demise. A man living nearby reported hearing what sounded like gunshots, and then saw a Volkswagen Bug speeding away from the scene. However, Detective Ronald Merriman did not see this, and there were no reports of late-night high-speed chases in downtown Albuquerque that night. Police used the written directions they found on the floor of Caitlin's car to lead them to Sharon Smith's house. Sharon told APD that Caitlin arrived at her home at 9:30 p.m. However, Sharon later made considerable effort to locate and phone Caitlin's family, who had moved out of state, to tell them that Caitlin arrived at her home at approximately 7 p.m., having come directly from a 5 p.m. movie at a nearby theater. This was impossible. Since Caitlin had left her parents' house at 6:15 p.m., she could not have attended that movie. During her phone conversation with Caitlin's mother, Sharon described her final evening. She said Caitlin seemed very upset, kept bursting into tears for no apparent reason, and made Sharon phone her apartment over and over to see if Dung was there. She did not want to speak to him, just to nail down his whereabouts. There was never an answer. Sharon dialed the apartment for the final time at 10:40 p.m. There was still no answer. A few weeks later, Lois found out something troubling, something that was a clue. There were 3 phone calls from Caitlin's apartment, almost at the exact time she passed away, since both Caitlin and her boyfriend were at the hospital. Who was this mystery caller? The calls were made minutes after she had been pronounced deceased. The number, oddly, belonged to a paralegal in Orange County, a Vietnamese paralegal. According to neighbors, Caitlin was afraid of Dung's friends, especially when they only spoke in Vietnamese around her. They would make fun of her, and there was an air of hatred. Was all this connected somehow? The police conducted 6 months of thorough investigations and concluded that it was just a random act of violence. Perhaps a mugging gone wrong, or she got caught up in a gang war. But Lois refused to believe this. She knew there was something deeper at play here. She vowed not to give up on Caitlin so easily. Lois hired her own private investigator to gather more information. Pat Caristo, the investigator, was quite well paid and famous. Caitlin's insurance claim was due to an insurance fraud, a fraud she had not committed by herself. It was the result of being tied up with an infamous criminal organization. Caitlin and Dung had gone to Southern California in April that year. They became involved in the scam when Dung hit another car, but this entire thing was pre-planned. In March, Caitlin had used her mother's credit card to rent a car. A Vietnamese gang set up a car accident to get insurance money. Participants in the staged accident were supposed to claim soft tissue injuries to their necks and lower backs, receiving treatment from a complicit doctor. A law firm in Orange County, California managed all the insurance claims. Caitlin and her boyfriend received $1,500 as their portion of the settlement. Initially, everything was completely fine, but Pat Caristo had some more information. Caitlin found out that it was not just a $1,500 scam, it was a multi-million-dollar settlement. If Caitlin was breaking up with a criminal, she was possibly considered to be compromised. Could it be that she was targeted? An interesting development was that the Vietnamese paralegal, whose number had been called from her apartment, was responsible for setting up the car accident for insurance scams. 2 men were charged with fatally shooting Caitlin, but the case was dismissed by the DA because there was not enough evidence to prove anything. It was all circumstantial, and even that was too scarce to prove they were behind it. But originally, there were 4 of them. The arrest was based on a statement from a teenager, Robert Garcia, who later claimed he only confessed after many hours of police bullying and scaring. Garcia stated he was with Dennis Martinez in the back seat of Yuva's Camaro and witnessed the shooting, identifying Miguel as the shooter and alleging that Yuva dared him to do it. However, it was later discovered that Robert Garcia was incarcerated at a juvenile detention center at the time of the shooting. The case was dismissed 18 months later, but the damage was already done. Since he was incarcerated, it made it impossible to have been an eyewitness. Consequently, the district attorney dropped all charges due to a lack of evidence. Juvenile Escobedo was 21 when he and 3 other young men from his Martineztown neighborhood were arrested and charged with the slaying of Caitlin Arquette. Shortly after the charges were announced, his life changed forever. Escobedo had aspirations of opening a mechanic shop or becoming a police officer before his wrongful arrest. The fallout from the case and the accompanying publicity dramatically altered the course of his life. The book written by Lois Duncan, Who Took the Life of My Daughter, surrounding a mother's quest for her daughter's perpetrator, mentioned his name throughout as one of the main suspects, further embedding his association with the crime in the public's mind. The wrongful arrest shattered Escobedo's plans and prospects. He became hesitant to reveal his full name and struggled to secure the kinds of jobs he wanted. The stigma of being linked to such a high-profile case lingered, making it nearly impossible for him to rebuild his life and pursue his original dreams. There were strange circumstances surrounding the investigation. On July 21, 1989, the day of Caitlin's funeral, Sharon Smith, the last person to see Caitlin before the shooting, missed the funeral because she was in the emergency room with a severely wounded arm. Although she claimed the injury was caused by her pet dog, the scar suggested otherwise, and Sharon refused to sign a permit to release the emergency room report, raising suspicions of intimidation. Later that evening, Deng Guayin was stabbed in the abdomen in the room of one of the men who provided his alibi for the night of the shooting. While this was labeled an alleged taking-your-own-life attempt, the circumstances strongly indicated otherwise, suggesting he may have been intimidated as well. 2 weeks after Caitlin's slaying, Ray Padilla, Deng's close friend and illegal substance supplier, allegedly attempted to take his own life by slashing his wrist. On the same day, Padilla's friends, Elena Chavez and Kathy Sanchez, who were with him at the time, also had their arms and wrists slashed in what were also deemed alleged attempts on taking their own lives. Why would completely normal, healthy people all want to end their lives at the same time on the same day? It did not make sense. Rather big coincidence. 3 weeks after his arrest with Miguel Garcia and Yuvi Escobedo, Dennis Marty Martinez was found with a slashed wrist, another alleged taking-your-own-life attempt, but he survived. On February 4, 1992, shortly after being released from prison when charges were dropped, Miguel Garcia was shot in the abdomen in an incident labeled as an alleged taking-your-own-life attempt. He survived despite the bullet nearly paralyzing him. On September 24, 2003, Robert Garcia, initially claimed by APD to be an eyewitness to Miguel Garcia shooting Caitlin, was found passed away due to an illegal substance overdose with his body dragged into an alley. But Pat Caristo, the investigator, had her doubts. She pursued a lead. A man named Paul Apodaca had been in the vicinity. The 21-year-old would go to prison for assault charges much later, and Caristo ended up visiting him in 1995. Paul was incarcerated for assault against his 14-year-old sister, which is deeply disturbing. The man was very cooperative, according to the investigator. He immediately admitted that he was at the scene of the crime, but he did hesitate a little when Caristo asked him if someone was with him the night of July 16, 1989. He got defensive, snapping, "What do you mean somebody was with me? Who said somebody was with me? Nobody was with me." He was also quite curious, asking, "How did you find me?" Pat Caristo found it interesting, but she was not able to prove anything with just a defensive attitude. Paul told Pat that he was in the neighborhood that night to buy illegal substances from his dealer, Ray Lee Padilla. Padilla is the brother of an Albuquerque Police Department undercover narcotics officer, who is also a friend of Mary and Wallace, the first officer dispatched to the scene. This led the private investigator to suspect possible police corruption in the case and ties to Deng Guyan, as Ray Padilla was his friend too. The following year in 1989, when Paul Apodaca was arrested for shooting a victim from his car, he tried to get off by presenting another man's ID that showed him to be Ray Lee Padilla. Caitlin's mother knew this was either a setup or something serious. Her 1973 book, I Know What You Did Last Summer, became an even more of an international hit when Hollywood decided to buy rights from Lois Duncan. And loosely based on her book, they released a movie of the same title in 1997. Now Lois had a lot of income that could be used to find Caitlin's assailant. Tragically, nobody tied these cases together. There was nothing to link them together at all. All three cases separately went cold. Days, weeks, months, years, and finally decades would pass. Sadly, Lois Duncan, after dedicating her life to finding her daughter's assailant, would pass away in 2016. The mystery still unsolved. In 2021, a man was picked up by the New Mexico Police Department when he violated his probation. Homeless and possibly suffering from heat stroke, he expressed a desire to talk to the police. Originally from Albuquerque, his name was Paul Apodaca. He had a troubled past that included a series of violent crimes in the late 1980s and early 1990s. His arrest and subsequent confessions brought new light to several cold cases, revealing his involvement in some cold cases during that period. His life had spiraled into instability and homelessness, which resulted in his recent encounter with law enforcement. This man, head hung in shame, was confessing to gruesome crimes he committed against teenage girls. The detective was quite shocked. She had not expected the perpetrator to come forward, especially since these crimes had been committed decades ago. Before he went on to say anything further, the detective quickly read him his Miranda so that the confession could be admissible in court. He went on to say something that shocked the officer. Paul Apodaca went on, speaking from memory, but did not know his victims' names. 3 decades had passed. The detective did not understand. Why now? After all these years, the detectives realized who all the victims were from the dates, locations, and circumstances. He allegedly confessed to the violent slayings as he spoke about his hatred for women and provided detectives with information that only the assailant could have known. Paul's history was quite disturbing. He was charged with assaulting his 14-year-old stepsister in 1995. He was a registered offender in New Mexico. Paul Apodaca's criminal activities began on June 22, 1988, when he targeted Althea Oakley. Paul, who was working as a security guard at the Technical Vocational Institute, which is now Central New Mexico Community College, noticed her and began to follow her. Despite Althea smiling at him, he viciously attacked her. He later admitted to police that he followed her along Buena Vista Boulevard to the Lobo parking lot, where he intended to assault her at knife point. He admitted to stabbing her multiple times. In addition to Althea's case, he later confessed to taking the lives of 2 other young women and intimately assaulting 3 others between 1988 and 1993. He admitted to coming across Stella Gonzalez in September 1988, and he also told the authorities that he was driving by the girls when he shot Stella. There was no motive. She was just an easy target for him. One of the assaults aside from these 3 from 1993 had been stuck in the assault kit backlog and had been matched to his through the Cody's DNA database. The case was then reopened. According to Lois Duncan's other daughter, Caitlin's sister, Carrie Arquette, she could feel her mother's presence in the days leading up to the arrest. She felt like her mother was looking down and would finally have peace. Paul's actions had made her all about Caitlin. She could never overcome losing a child at that age. Paul confessed to taking the life of these women, explaining that his actions stemmed from deep-seated hatred and jealousy toward women, influenced by witnessing men mistreat women during his upbringing. He believed women preferred bad guys and resented being rejected despite trying to be nice. Juvenal Escobedo, now 55, has been anxiously awaiting updates on the case, regularly checking TV stations for answers. When Paul Apodaca was arrested in 2021, it resurfaced all his painful memories. For the past 2 years, he was battling sleepless nights, worrying that he might somehow be dragged back into the situation. The past 2 years have also brought significant changes to Juvenile's life. He welcomed his first grandchild and rekindled his passion for painting, a hobby he had enjoyed in high school, but had set aside for decades. Upon learning that Paul pleaded guilty, Juvenile found himself still trying to process the entire situation. He felt relieved that Caitlin Arquette and her mother could now find peace. However, he also yearned for reparation and clarity about how he became involved in the case, and he expressed a desire for a share of any book earnings related to the story. Many believed that Paul Apotica was homeless, broke, and unemployed, so he confessed to the crimes as a way to have free food and shelter. Others believe there is something more sinister at play. While his lawyer insisted that he was innocent of the slayings and only gave the confession because he was intoxicated and not mentally well, Paul had pled guilty to 5 charges of ending someone's life. On January 25, 2024, Paul Apodaca, at 56 years old, was sentenced to 62 years with 45 years in prison. But there are rumors that this is a cover-up. Is Paul Apodaca truly behind these heinous crimes? Because Caitlin Arquette's tragedy is far more complicated than the way Paul described it. True, he knew details only the assailant knew, but was he hired as a hitman for the Vietnamese gang Caitlin was involved with? The circumstances surrounding Caitlin's tragedy are certainly suspicious. So many unanswered questions. In the neighborhood of Chevy Chase, Maryland, a brutal slaying stunned residents and baffled police for over 2 decades. On a morning in May 2001, Leslie Pryor, a 50-year-old mother and advertising executive, was found savagely beaten in her home. The crime scene awash with blood and unanswered questions. The case went cold, with no leads or suspects until now. Decades later, through groundbreaking use of genetic genealogy, a shocking arrest was finally made. Those that knew and loved Leslie Pryor would be stunned to learn that the perpetrator responsible for her horrific end was hiding in plain sight all along. Leslie Jennings Pryor was known as a warm and dedicated mother, wife, and professional. Her life seemed picturesque. She had a loving husband, Sandy Pryor, and a devoted daughter, Lauren. Leslie worked for Specialties Incorporated, an advertising production company in Northwest D.C. Leslie and Sandy had built a life together that was filled with shared joys from summer vacations to simple family dinners around the kitchen island. But the Pryor family would allow someone into their lives that, unbeknownst to them, would shatter their world forever. On May 2, 2001, 50-year-old Leslie Pryor's routine day took a tragic turn. She did not show up for work, prompting concern from both her co-workers and her husband. Montgomery County Police Department were dispatched to the Pryor family home on Drummond Avenue. Officers arrived at the house to find a disturbing scene: blood in the foyer and no sign of Leslie. As they entered deeper into the home, they made the horrifying discovery of Leslie Pryor's lifeless body in the main bedroom's shower. Leslie was attacked with savage force, her body enduring multiple blunt force traumas and strangulation. Evidence of her desperate struggle was found beneath her fingernails, mingled with her attacker's blood. Along with signs of manual strangulation, there were V-shaped cuts to her head that matched the sharp corners of the foyer molding. This indicated where her head had been repeatedly battered. Investigators believe that the perpetrator carried her from the foyer, attempting to wash away the blood and minimize the mess. The scene had evidence of a hasty cleanup, with luminescence tests revealing traces of blood in the foyer, a trash can, sinks in the kitchen and downstairs bathroom, and on door frames and the back door. The initial investigation into Leslie's violent end was thorough, but ultimately frustrating. Early DNA analysis was able to determine that the DNA collected at the scene belonged to an unknown male, but it did not match anyone in Leslie's immediate circle, including her husband Sandy. Leslie's daughter, Lauren, provided the police with a list of close family associates. Among the names on that list was the eventual perpetrator, though investigators did not immediately consider him a prime suspect. As the weeks turned into months, the case grew cold. The police continued to work, re-interviewing potential witnesses and reviewing evidence, but the trail seemed to go nowhere. Neighbors had not seen anything unusual on that fateful day, and the quiet, low-crime neighborhood offered few clues. The lack of forced entry suggested that the person responsible for the crime was someone Leslie knew, but no one could pinpoint who that person might be. Leslie's family struggled with the lack of answers. Her husband, Sandy, was briefly considered a suspect but was soon cleared, persisted in seeking justice for her mother, constantly urging detectives to keep the case alive. Years passed and hope began to wane. The investigation into Leslie's case became one of Montgomery County's most challenging cold cases. Detectives, both seasoned and new, took turns sifting through the old evidence, hoping for a breakthrough that never seemed to come. It was not until September 2022 that a glimmer of hope appeared. Investigators decided to submit the blood evidence from the crime scene to Othram. This decision would eventually lead to the long-awaited breakthrough that would crack the case wide open and bring Leslie's perpetrator to justice. The lab was able to develop a more complete DNA profile of the suspect, which was then sent to Family Tree DNA, a consumer-based genealogy company. The results pointed to the Gliger surname, leading detectives to reconnect this lead with an old tip about a man connected to the Pryor family, Eugene Gliger. Leslie's daughter, Lauren Pryor, was 16 years old when she first met Eugene. They were classmates at Bethesda Chevy Chase High School and quickly became an inseparable couple. Eugene, with his deep brown hair and wide smile, was popular and well-liked among their peers. He had dreams of becoming a computer engineer and often participated in social activities. Eugene's family life was turbulent. He struggled with his parents' divorce and had relatives known for their volatile tempers. Despite these challenges, Eugene maintained a facade of normalcy, never displaying violent tendencies around Lauren or her family. Their families lived close by, which meant Eugene was frequently at the Pryor home. Leslie and Sandy welcomed him, treating him almost like a second son. Eugene joined them on family trips to the Outer Banks and Delaware beaches, where they played board games and built fond memories. While Leslie always spoke fondly of Eugene, Sandy had reservations, sensing something off about him, although he never had any concrete reasons to justify his unease. In June 2024, investigators collected Eugene's DNA from a discarded water bottle they saw him use and discard at Dulles International Airport. It was then confirmed it matched the DNA found at the crime scene. This led to his arrest on June 18, 2024, bringing a significant step towards justice to the long, cold case. Now 44 years old, Eugene Gliger faces first-degree charges and was extradited from Washington, D.C. to Maryland. The arrest of Eugene Gliger for the slaying of Leslie Pryor brought a mix of shock and relief to everyone, but especially to her daughter, Lauren. The revelation that her former boyfriend was the suspected perpetrator added a layer of personal betrayal to an already painful ordeal. She dated Gliger for 5 years, but had not spoken to him for several years at the time of her mother's demise. Soon after the funeral, Lauren recalled, she ran into him at a bar in Bethesda. She said she told him that her mom had lost her life, and he looked at her and replied, "I am so sorry. I have spoken to him. He did not seem weird." How you can look somebody in the eye knowing that you committed this crime and act like nothing happened is pretty unreal. Despite the breakthrough in the case, the police have not yet provided a clear motive for the brutal crime. Gliger is being held without bond. Prosecutors said he is a frequent international traveler and they see him as a flight risk. As they wait for the trial to commence, the Pryor family and the community hope for further answers and justice for Leslie. After 2 decades of searching for answers, a significant breakthrough has emerged in the case of Elena Teresa Adele Laswell. Elena Laswell, a 15-year-old whose life was cut tragically short, has been at the center of a relentless investigation for 2 decades. Her brutal end on July 10, 2004, left a void that her family and community have been grappling with ever since. On the 20th anniversary of her passing, an arrest has finally breathed new life into a case that had grown cold. Elena Laswell was born on January 17, 1989 in Phoenix, Arizona. Her family, her parents, Steve and Molly, her 4 brothers and her sister, held her in the highest regard. She was an avid participant in team sports growing up, enjoyed creating art, and had a special bond with animals. She attended several local schools, including St. Gregory's Catholic School, Serene Elementary School, and Phoenix Preparatory Academy, where she graduated in May 2004. Elena was eagerly anticipating starting North High School in the fall of 2004, full of hopes and dreams for her future. Dreams that would be shattered by a senseless and unimaginable crime. On July 10, 2004, at around 8 p.m. that evening, police responded to a distressing 911 call from a home on North 21st Drive in Phoenix, Arizona. After arrival, officers were directed to a room where they found 15-year-old Elena Laswell, severely injured and barely alive. Even with immediate emergency efforts, Elena was pronounced deceased at the scene. The case was subsequently handed over to the slayings detectives. Despite their diligent work and numerous investigations, they were unable to identify any suspects, and the case eventually grew cold. For years, Elena's family and the Phoenix Police Department faced the painful and unresolved frustration of an unsolved crime, with little hope for closure. Years later, a pivotal breakthrough surfaced. In 2012, advancements in DNA technology allowed detectives to re-examine evidence from the crime scene. Using sophisticated DNA collection and analysis techniques, investigators identified a profile that matched Sergio Francisco Reyes. By March 2013, the DNA evidence conclusively identified Reyes as a primary suspect. Sergio Reyes was 17 years old at the time of the crime, in 2004, and his connection to the tragedy was not immediately known to investigators. Reyes was indicted by Maricopa County Grand Jury in 2014. But because he was residing in Mexico at the time, extradition procedures were required to bring him back to the United States. This process involved cooperation with U.S. Marshals and Mexican authorities. On July 10, 2024, the 20th anniversary of Elena's passing, Reyes was arrested and extradited to Phoenix. He faces multiple charges, including first-degree assault, kidnapping, and burglary. His bond was set at $1.5 million. The Phoenix Police Department has not disclosed whether Reyes had any prior connection to Elena. Elena's family, including her parents and siblings, have expressed a mixture of relief and continued sorrow. Her aunt, Katie Turville, said, "Knowing that someone is being held responsible feels awesome. It has been a long haul, and thank God for Phoenix PD, they have been absolutely amazing. I just really felt that they were on the right trail and that they would get it. I just did not know when." Elena's mother had passed away in the years since her daughter's slaying. But Katie said the mother's wish was not revenge. She wonders what Elena's life could have been. Wondering, you know what? Would she be married? What would she be doing now? All the typical things that you will not get to see. She calls Reyes a monster. It is hard to see a monster in real life because they do not look like what we grew up thinking a monster was. Elena's father, Steve Laswell, said, "After 20 years, to be truthful, I really was not expecting any further progress on the case. Having him arrested would prevent him from doing any other things like that. That was the primary hope." He also said, "And we think about what she might have been today. I would really sincerely like to thank the Phoenix Police Department and everyone who was involved in this for hanging in there for this long and having success." The family's grief is tempered by a sense of closure as they await the legal proceedings that will unfold. In the chill of a December morning in 1999, Sanford, Florida was gripped by a chilling discovery. A woman's lifeless body brutally discarded in the woods, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. Sherry Holtz, just 50 years old, was found with signs of unspeakable violence. For nearly a quarter of a century, the person responsible remained elusive. That was until forensic science advances led investigators to someone close to home. Sherry was in a long-term relationship with Gary Durrance, a man who, despite being described as her longtime boyfriend, was also known for a history of domestic disputes. The couple had lived together in a shared home in Sanford with 3 other roommates. Their relationship, while significant, was fraught with tension, marked by frequent arguments and incidents of domestic violence. In the years leading up to the crime, Sanford had become familiar with the couple's troubled dynamic. Police records from 1996 to 1999 revealed multiple domestic disputes between the troubled couple. These incidents painted a picture of a relationship struggling under the weight of constant fights and arguments. On December 2, 1999, just 2 days before Sherry's demise. A particularly volatile argument led to Gary kicking Sherry out of their shared residence. This act was a pivotal moment in the case and set the stage for the tragic events that would follow. With Sherry now estranged from her boyfriend and left to fend for herself, she spent her last hours at a local bar, a place she frequented for solace and social interaction. Sherry was last seen leaving the bar on the evening of December 3, 1999. Her departure from the bar would be the last sighting of her before she was found lifeless in the woods of Sanford on December 4. Sherry was found lying on a concrete slab about 20 feet into the woods, her body showing clear signs of a violent and brutal assault. The nature of her injuries, blunt force trauma to the head, strangulation, assault, and a slashed throat, were horrific signs of a crime of extreme violence. Her body was positioned in a manner that suggested a deliberate attempt to hide her, and a bloody lock blade knife was found near her body. Although the knife was suspected to be a crucial piece of evidence, the technology available at the time was insufficient to analyze the DNA samples effectively. The blood on the knife, combined with the other DNA evidence collected, proved difficult to test, due to the limitations of forensic technology in 2000. This would prove to be a significant hurdle in solving the case. Investigators also focused on Sherry's recent activities and relationships. This information brought Gary into the spotlight as a person of interest. Witnesses from the local bar where Sherry was last seen provided valuable information. They confirmed that she had left the bar on December 3rd, but their accounts could not place her at the scene of the crime. This left investigators with few leads and no clear suspects beyond Durrance, who denied any involvement in the crime. The investigation also included attempts to trace Sherry's final movements and to identify potential witnesses who might have seen or heard something relevant to the case. Despite these efforts, the lack of concrete evidence and the passage of time made the case go cold. In May 2023, the Sanford Police Department reopened the cold case, driven by the advances in forensic science. Modern DNA analysis methods, capable of handling smaller and more degraded samples, were employed to re-examine the preserved evidence. This reanalysis proved pivotal. The DNA from the knife's blade was confirmed to be Sherry's blood, while the handle of the knife contained DNA that matched Gary Durrance, Sherry's longtime boyfriend. This was a crucial breakthrough, as Gary had been a person of interest due to his tumultuous relationship with Sherry and their reported domestic disputes. The new DNA evidence was further supported by re-interviews with witnesses and statements made by Gary, which indicated he had knowledge of the crime scene before it was officially discovered. These statements, made before the crime's details were publicly known, reinforced the case against him. This technological breakthrough not only identified him, but also enabled authorities to obtain an arrest warrant on July 17, 2024. He was subsequently taken into custody the following day and charged with second-degree slaying. The resolution of Sherry Holtz's case, after nearly 25 years, highlights the profound impact that advancements in forensic technology can have on cold cases. The identification and arrest of Gary Durrance is a testament to the relentless pursuit of justice by law enforcement and the evolving capabilities of forensic science. The DNA breakthrough, which linked Gary Durrance to the crime scene, demonstrates how even the most challenging cases can be reopened and solved with modern tools and techniques. For Sherry's family and the Sanford community, this arrest offers a long-awaited sense of closure and justice. For a brutal and senseless crime, Durrance is being held at Seminole County's John E. Polk Correctional Facility and has a court appearance scheduled for September 10, 2024. In the quiet town of Prunedale, California, a chilling mystery from 1991 has resurfaced with startling new developments. For over 3 decades, the brutal double-slaying of beloved restaurant owner George Smith and his frail mother-in-law, Eva Thompson, remained unsolved until now. Following a groundbreaking advance in DNA testing, an arrest of a former employee has reignited this haunting case, leaving many still wondering why. George Smith and his wife, Anna, were well-known figures in their community. In 1991, they owned and operated Smith's Restaurant, a popular family diner situated on El Camino Real. The restaurant was a cherished local establishment known for its warm atmosphere and delicious meals, drawing customers from near and far. George Smith, at 67 years old, was the face of this thriving business, which had become a cornerstone of Prunedale's social life. His wife, Anna, was deeply involved in both the restaurant and their personal life, managing the day-to-day operations and maintaining their home. Their lives were intertwined with the community they served so well. Eva Thompson, Anna's 79-year-old mother, lived with them, relying on a hospital-style bed due to her inability to walk. Despite her condition, Eva was a beloved member of the household, and her presence was a comforting constant in the Smiths' lives. On November 11, 1991, a crisp autumn day turned into a nightmare for the Smith family and the small town of Prunedale. Anna Smith, having spent the day running errands, returned home in the early evening to a scene of unimaginable horror. Was now a crime scene. George Smith was discovered in his office, where he had been violently attacked. The desk, once a place for bookkeeping, now housed evidence of a savage assault. George had been seated, his life cut short in a gruesome act of brutality as he was stabbed from behind. In a separate part of the house, Eva Thompson, Anna's 79-year-old mother, was found in her hospital-style bed. Unable to walk and bedridden, Eva had been defenseless against her assailant. The violence inflicted upon her was equally merciless, and she too had been fatally stabbed. The crime scene seemed to have the hallmarks of a ruthless burglary gone awry. The screen of the house's door had been slashed, indicating forced entry. The brutality of the stabbings was evident, with both victims showing signs of defensive injuries, suggesting they had fought valiantly against their attacker. The initial investigation was chaotic but methodical. Crime scene investigators worked meticulously to collect evidence from the home and restaurant. They combed through the premises, searching for anything that could shed light on the identity of the perpetrator. The slashed screen door, the brutalized bodies, and the disarray within the house were carefully examined. Forensic teams gathered physical evidence including potential DNA samples, fingerprints, and any trace of the weapon used. Early on, attention turned to potential suspects. Given that the crime involved a burglary and was committed with a knife, investigators considered individuals with a motive and knowledge of the property. The sheriff's office faced the difficult task of piecing together a case with limited leads. They followed various avenues, including interviewing potential witnesses, analyzing financial records, and exploring rumors of buried treasure that had circulated among the townspeople, but to no avail. The investigative efforts were hindered by the lack of immediate forensic breakthroughs. The DNA technology of the early 1990s was not as advanced as it would become, and initial tests did not yield conclusive results. As a result, the case remained open with suspects, but no arrest was made. Decades after the brutal slayings of George Smith and Eva Thompson, a breakthrough came with the advancement of DNA technology. In early 2024, an additional round of DNA testing on evidence collected from the crime scene yielded crucial results that had eluded investigators in the years prior. The reevaluation of forensic evidence made possible by improvements in DNA analysis techniques provided the concrete evidence needed to charge Ira Ulysses Bastian with the crime. Bastian was a former employee who worked at Smith's restaurant about a year and a half before the crime. Bastian's tenure at the restaurant was marked by his reliability, but little did anyone know his connection to the Smiths would take a dark and violent turn. His past employment at the restaurant, combined with his familiarity with the Smiths, made him a prime suspect in 1991. Bastian was not apprehended due to a lack of evidence then. The renewed investigation focused on the DNA samples recovered from the crime scene, including traces found on the weapon and at the points of forced entry. The sophisticated testing, which went beyond the capabilities of early 1990s technology, allowed investigators to match the DNA to Bastian with a high degree of certainty, but also helped confirm his involvement in the brutal acts committed against the Smiths. As the evidence mounted, so did the investigation into Bastian's potential motive. Among the theories was the speculation that the slayings were driven by a desire to find hidden treasure. Rumors had circulated in the Prunedale community that George Smith and his wife had buried valuable items, such as gold coins or rare currency, on their property. This theory of buried treasure became a central element in the case's story, fueling speculation about why Bastian might have targeted the Smiths. Bastian's prior employment at Smith's restaurant gave him a unique insight into the layout of the property and the habits of its owners. Investigators explored whether this familiarity could have facilitated the crime and contributed to the motive. If Bastian was indeed aware of any rumors about hidden valuables, it would have provided him with a potential incentive to commit the crime. 85-year-old Ira Ulysses Bastian was arrested on July 15, 2024, and taken into custody without incident. Following his arrest, he was charged with 2 counts of first degree. At his arraignment on July 16, 2024, Bastian pleaded not guilty to the charges and the specifics of the alleged motive. What was once a cold case plagued by insufficient evidence was reignited through cutting-edge DNA analysis, allowing law enforcement to finally link Ira Ulysses Bastian to the brutal crimes. For the Smith and Thompson families and for the community of Prunedale, this case is a painful reminder of the profound impact of violence, especially against those who are as the legal process unfolds. There is a collective hope that justice will finally bring some measure of closure to a case known for such senseless brutality. In the quiet winter of 1980, the body of 19-year-old Barbara Mae Tucker was found brutally slain on the outskirts of her college campus. For over 4 decades, the case was cold, until a discarded piece of chewing gum and the relentless pursuit of justice uncovered a dark secret that had been buried for years. Barbara Mae Tucker was a vibrant and driven 19-year-old who had a promising future ahead of her. A sophomore at Mount Hood Community College in Gresham, Oregon, Barbara was pursuing a business degree with aspirations that extended far beyond the classroom. Known for her tall, athletic build, she was a standout in sports, having competed in national basketball competitions and earned several awards for her abilities on the court. Barbara was also an avid artist with a deep love for creativity. She spent her free time sewing, knitting, crocheting, and even writing poetry and music. She had dreams of opening her own craft supply shop one day, combining her love of business and the arts. Little did anyone know that her life would be tragically cut short, and the small college town of Gresham would be left searching for answers for decades to come. On the evening of January 15, 1980, Barbara was on her way to a night class. Barbara had plans with a friend to grab ice cream after her consumer credit practices class, a small reward after a long day of learning. As the evening set in, Barbara made her way to campus, unaware that danger lurked nearby. After her class, she was seen heading toward the parking lot intending to leave for the night. But something went terribly wrong. It was there in the darkness that Barbara's life was brutally taken from her. The next morning, on January 16th, students began arriving for their classes at Mount Hood Community College, unaware of the grim discovery that lay ahead. Near one of the parking lots, in a wooded area between Kane Road and the campus, something caught the attention of a group of students, a sight so out of place that it drew them closer. There, partially hidden among the bushes, was the lifeless body of Barbara. She lay on the cold ground, her clothes disheveled, her books and purse scattered nearby, as if abandoned in a hurry. The horror of the scene was undeniable. The tall, athletic young woman, who had once been so full of life, was now a victim of a brutal assault. Police were called, and soon the area was swarming with investigators, each one trying to make sense of the tragedy that had occurred. The college grounds had become a crime scene, with yellow tape marking off the area where Barbara had spent her final moments. As authorities carefully examined the scene, the details of the slaying began to paint a chilling picture. There were clear signs of a struggle, with dirt covering her clothes and skin. This suggested that she had struggled against her attacker in a desperate attempt to survive, but was tragically overpowered. The medical examiner determined that she had been beaten severely. With blunt force injuries to her head that were so catastrophic, they collapsed one of her eye sockets and fractured her skull. These brutal injuries were found to be the cause of her demise. As investigators quickly worked to find out what happened to Barbara, detectives combed through every inch of the area, looking for any clue that might lead them to her assailant. But despite the horror of the crime scene, concrete clues were scarce. Witnesses reported seeing Barbara running into the street near the campus on the fateful evening. She frantically waved her arms as if trying to flag down help. Unfortunately, they assumed it was a college prank. Some witnesses even saw a man leading her back into the wooded area, but descriptions of the man varied, making it difficult to identify a suspect. Investigators also found 3 large pools of blood near where Barbara's body was discovered. The blood was type O, matching Barbara's blood type. Drag marks in the soil nearby indicated that her body had been moved, likely dragged from the place where she was initially attacked to where she was later found. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was the discovery of male DNA inside Barbara's body and on a towel that had been draped over her by someone who found her. This evidence would prove critical, but in 1980, DNA technology was not advanced enough to make a definitive identification of her attacker. Instead, the case hinged on more traditional investigative methods. Following up on leads and trying to build a profile of the perpetrator, the investigation dragged on for years with detectives revisiting the case repeatedly. The lack of clear evidence or a strong suspect kept the case cold for decades despite the best efforts of law enforcement. However, the clues they had, Barbara's injuries, the blood at the scene, and the male DNA found on her body, remained preserved in evidence, waiting for the day when science could finally catch up and provide the answers that had eluded investigators for so long. In 2000, the Oregon State Police Crime Lab analyzed the DNA swabs taken during Barbara's autopsy. They created a profile that, while incomplete, marked the first step toward identifying the unknown perpetrator. But it would take another 2 decades and the emergence of genetic genealogy to unlock the true potential of this evidence. In 2021, a genealogist from Parabon Nanolabs, known for pioneering work and using DNA to solve cold cases, took on Barbara's case. By uploading the DNA profile to a public genealogy database called GEDmatch, the genealogist was able to trace familial connections, slowly narrowing down the pool of possible suspects. This painstaking process led to the identification of Robert Arthur Plimpton as a likely contributor to the DNA found at the crime scene. At the time of Barbara's case, Plimpton was a 16-year-old living less than 1.5 miles from where her body was discovered. The connection was chilling. A young man from the same community who had lived in proximity to his victim but had gone unnoticed as a suspect for decades. With Plimpton identified as a person of interest, Gresham police began to surveil him. They watched his movements closely, waiting for the opportunity to collect a fresh DNA sample that could confirm the match. That opportunity came when detectives observed Plimpton throw out a piece of chewing gum. The gum would become the critical piece of evidence that finally tied him to the crime. When the DNA from the chewing gum was compared to the profile developed from the 2000 DNA swabs, it was a match. The same DNA that had been left at the scene of Barbara's brutal slaying all those years ago was now traced to Plimpton, conclusively linking him to her violent end. This breakthrough was monumental not just for the detectives who had worked tirelessly on the case, but for Barbara's family, who had waited 41 long years for answers. In June 2021, 60-year-old Plimpton was arrested. He had lived much of his life in relative obscurity, but as investigators began to dig into his past, a darker picture of his character began to emerge. Plimpton had a criminal history that included a conviction for second-degree kidnapping in 1985, just 5 years after Barbara's life was taken. He had also faced charges of DUI, parole violations, and, in 1997, allegations of attempted sodomy and assault. Though these charges were ultimately dismissed, they painted a disturbing portrait of a man with a history of violent behavior. Despite this past, Plimpton had managed to evade suspicion in Barbara's case for decades. He had lived his life, got married, and had children. But the breakthrough in DNA technology had finally caught up with him, and there would be no escape from the evidence that now pointed squarely at him. Plimpton was charged with first degree in connection to Barbara's case. He pleaded not guilty, maintaining his innocence despite the overwhelming DNA evidence against him. His defense team argued that there was reasonable doubt. They questioned the reliability of the eyewitness accounts and suggested that the DNA evidence, while compelling, was not enough to definitively prove his guilt. The trial, which took place between February 26 and March 15, 2024, was a bench trial with Multnomah County Circuit Judge Amy Baggio presiding over the case. The prosecution laid out a meticulous case presenting the DNA evidence that had led to Plimpton's identification and highlighting the similarities between Plimpton's history of violence and the nature of Barbara's slaying. One of the key moments in the trial came when Judge Baggio reviewed the DNA evidence linking Plimpton to the crime scene. She noted that the match between the DNA found on Barbara's body and the DNA from Plimpton's discarded chewing gum was incontrovertible. Even with the defense's efforts to cast doubt on the case, the scientific evidence was too strong to ignore. In her ruling, Judge Baggio expressed no doubt about Plimpton's guilt. She stated that Plimpton had assaulted and beaten Barbara Tucker to her violent end. Unfortunately, despite the evidence of assault, Plimpton was not convicted of that part of the crime. The prosecution was unable to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the assault had occurred while Barbara was still alive. Even so, the conviction brought a measure of closure to Barbara's family, who had waited so long for justice. Her sister, Susan Putter, spoke of the deep pain that had lingered for years and the relief that came with Plimpton's conviction. She said, "Just not giving up. We always had hope. At one point, we thought he had lost his life. Maybe it would never be solved. I just wished it could have happened when the rest of my family was here, especially my parents." Detective Aaron Turnage told them he would not rest until the case was solved. He had the following to say, "I promised Susan I was going to solve this case. If that means working around the clock, that is what happens. There has been lots of hurdles, and sitting down and experiencing that, with the family last night, is something I have never experienced in my career. It is pretty awesome." While nothing could bring Barbara back, the knowledge that her assailant would finally face the consequences of his actions provided some solace. Plimpton remains in custody in Multnomah County, awaiting sentencing. His conviction on first-degree charges ensures that he will spend the rest of his life behind bars, unable to harm anyone else. In 1996, a young woman's life took a horrifying turn when her car broke down on a quiet Midland County road. What seemed like a stroke of luck, a stranger offering help, quickly morphed into a nightmare as she was abducted and assaulted in an isolated field. For decades, the crime went unsolved, the attacker vanishing without a trace. But nearly 30 years later, advancements in DNA technology broke the case wide open. In the days leading up to the crime, 18-year-old Nikki Triple was like any other young person navigating her daily life. Living in the quiet rural expanse of Midland County, Michigan, she was preparing for another evening at home after a long day. The weather was typical for January, cold and potentially hazardous for travel. On the night of January 7, 1996, she set out to drive home, likely expecting the ride to be uneventful. But as she traveled along the isolated roads, her vehicle experienced a mechanical failure that left her stranded and alone in a sparsely populated area. At that moment, the man who would become her assailant drove by. He was a stranger, seemingly arriving as a good Samaritan, offering his assistance. He presented himself as a concerned individual ready to help, which, in her vulnerable state, seemed like a stroke of luck. She accepted his offer, trusting his appearance of goodwill. With the car pushed off the road and the immediate danger of being stuck behind her, she was given the option of a ride home. The man's offer appeared to be a straightforward act of kindness, one that the woman gratefully accepted. Little did she know this act of apparent generosity would soon turn into a horrifying nightmare. Instead of taking her home, he drove her to an isolated field in a remote part of the county. He brutally assaulted her, a horrifying betrayal of the trust she had placed in him. After the attack, he instructed her to get dressed and then drove her back towards the road. As they drove, the sight of approaching emergency vehicle lights triggered a desperate attempt by the man to evade detection. He stopped the car, allowing the traumatized victim to escape. She ran to her home, where she immediately told her mother about the assault. Her mother, in turn, contacted the police. Nikki was quickly taken to the Mid-Michigan Medical Center emergency room, where she was treated and an assault evidence kit was collected. Despite these immediate actions and the evidence gathered, the investigation faced a major setback. No suspect was identified at that time, leaving the case to grow cold as the years went by. The assault evidence kit collected was meticulously preserved, but without a suspect to match it to. The trail hit an end. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, law enforcement continued to work on the case sporadically. But the lack of progress and the passage of time made the prospect of solving it appear increasingly more difficult. The victim, meanwhile, faced the profound impact of her trauma, struggling with the lasting effects of the assault, while the case against her attacker seemed to drift further into obscurity. By the 2010s, technological advancements in forensic science began to offer new possibilities for old cases. But even with these advancements, the case remained unsolved, as the detective team faced the daunting task of piecing together long-dormant clues. The assault kit sat in evidence storage, and for nearly 2 decades, the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. In 2016, a wave of hope surged through Michigan as the state launched a project dedicated to examining long-neglected assault kits, including the one tied to this cold case. The Midland County Sheriff's Office, in collaboration with state resources, sent the decades-old evidence kit to Sorensen Forensics for analysis. It was a turning point. Sorensen Forensics was able to extract a full male DNA profile from the sample collected back in 1996. This profile was immediately entered into the state of Michigan's combined DNA index system in early 2018, but even with the promising development, no immediate matches were found in the database. The case was on the brink of another end until Detective Brent Benzing of the Midland County Sheriff's Office decided to explore the rapidly evolving field of genetic genealogy. He arranged for a groundbreaking analysis with Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon's researchers tapped into the growing database of GE match and family tree DNA, both of which have special programs that allow law enforcement access to their data for investigative purposes. By building extensive family trees from distant DNA matches and conducting meticulous descendancy research, Parabon's team managed to trace the suspect's lineage back to the Midland area. Through a careful process of elimination and investigation into physical characteristics like eye color, Detective Benzing and his team identified a likely suspect, Douglas L. Weber. In July 2022, Benzing met with Weber under the pretext of an interview at the Law Enforcement Center in Midland. During this interaction, Benzing obtained a buccal swab of Weber's DNA, authorized by a search warrant. The sample was sent to the Michigan State Police Crime L, and when the results came back, they confirmed what the detectives had been hoping for: a match with the DNA from the 1996 assault kit. 59-year-old Douglas L. Weber was arrested and charged with first-degree criminal conduct for the 1996 case. This arrest marked the culmination of years of painstaking investigative work and offered a glimmer of justice for Nikki, whose ordeal had remained unresolved for nearly 3 decades. In the months leading up to the trial, Weber faced significant legal challenges. His defense attorney argued that the crime did not reflect his client's character, citing Weber's lack of similar criminal history. Despite these claims, the gravity of the evidence against him remained overwhelming. The DNA match, along with the detailed investigative work, painted a clear picture of Weber's involvement in the crime. On December 6, 2023, Weber pleaded guilty to third-degree criminal conduct as part of a plea agreement. In exchange, the prosecution dropped the more severe first-degree criminal conduct charge and an unrelated charge of assaulting a jail employee. This plea deal spared Weber the possibility of a life sentence, but still carried significant consequences. The sentencing hearing took place on April 4, 2024, before Midland County Circuit Judge Michael J. Beal. During the hearing, a statement from Nikki, now in her 40s, was read aloud. Her words conveyed the profound and lasting impact the assault had on her life, detailing years of trauma, anxiety, and diminished self-worth. Weber, appearing in court wearing a medical mask, faced the victim's testimony and expressed remorse through his defense attorney. He acknowledged the harm he had caused and requested forgiveness, although his words did little to mitigate the severity of his actions. Judge Beal sentenced Weber to a prison term of 5 to 15 years, with credit for 519 days already served. Weber was also ordered to register as an offender. The sentence was a bittersweet resolution for Nikki Triple, offering a measure of justice while acknowledging the profound and enduring scars left by Weber's crime. In the quiet corridors of a Westminster hotel, a brutal crime was about to shatter the calm.